Blog Talk Radio.
Your journey begins right now. From the west coast of British Columbia to you listening around the world and blasting out into the universe, welcome to tonight's edition of Spaced Out Radio. Call us at 1-607-203-5344. Tweet us at Spaced Out Radio. Find Dave on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio or Skype us at Spaced Out Radio. Now, here's your host, Dave Scott.
Good evening and welcome to Spaced Out Radio tonight. I am your host, Dave Scott, and thanks so much for tuning in to the Spaced Out Radio Network at spacedoutradio.com as we come in from the frozen Canadian tundra, battle our way past the wild animals, sidestep Bigfoot, and enter Uncle Jimbo's cabin, stoke up the fire, heat this place up, and broadcast you live on this Wednesday night, early Thursday morning if you're on the East Coast. Here at Spaced Out Radio, we do this thing 7 days a week. Yes, we are your official, not one-stop shop when it comes to the supernatural, paranormal, conspiratorial, ufological, and so much more. You can follow us on social media on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show, and you can ask to join our private Spaced Out Radio group and our other group, Podcast Central. On Instagram, you can follow me at Dave Scott, SOR. And on our website, spacedoutradio.com, you can join our free forum. Let us know about your experiences and opinions for free. And if we want to join us in our Spaced Out Radio chat room, all you got to do is log in via Twitter or Facebook. And we welcome our listeners from the Spaced Out Radio chat room tonight. We also welcome our listeners from Paranormal Forum. If you go to our website, spacedoutradio.com, you can check out our great lineup of shows, check out our advertisers, and if you have a psychic question, please feel free to click on Cat's Corner, where one lucky listener's submitted question will be answered by our resident psychic, Catherine Fallman, per week. Rivulet Reiki and Readings is one of our top sponsors for tonight. They provide healings in person or at a distance. Spaced Out Radio listeners receive a 10% discount on pricing. PurplePlates.com to help heal your body, mind, and soul. Drop into their site and heal yourself today. 80,000 people a month read the new Agora newspaper. Find out what's happening around the world on the other side of politics, health, supernatural, paranormal, and so much more. And if you have an iPhone, you can download the Spirit Storybox. Spirit Storybox, the official ghost hunting app of Spaced Out Radio. Tonight we get into one of the most intriguing topics that we'll do on this show, and the events all started back in the year 2000 when some anonymous person started asking questions on an internet bulletin board. From there, the legend of John Titor was born. For the next year, anyone who is interested in time travel would start scouring the internet, looking for where and when this person was and when he would appear again. Titor was said to be a time traveler from the year 2036, and we're going to get more into that tonight. Tonight's guest and Titor follower is Mike Sauve. He's an author and a journalist who's written for the Canadian newspaper, The National Post. Mike's always been interested in time travel, and when he learned about John Titor, the yearning for more became almost like a research addiction. Mike's website is Mike Sauve, that's SAUVE.com, if you'd like to check out his work. So for the first time on this show, we're talking time travel. Do you believe that John Titor was a real traveler from the future, or do you think it was all just one giant elusive hoax? We'll find out tonight as we bring in Mike Sauve to Spaced Out Radio Land. Mike, thank you so much for joining us tonight. How are you?
I'm good. Thank you, Dave.
Mike, I want to get right into it with you for a second, and we're going to talk a lot about John Titor here for most of the show. But what made you so fascinated about time travel and the John Titor story?
Dave, like probably many listeners of this show, I've always been into the paranormal, the occult, and just growing up as a kid in the 90s, I remember, you kind of had to work a little bit harder to find this stuff. Like there might have been one show a week that you'd see. And then, as I got a little bit older, YouTube came around. There was just more and more of it. And so I guess it was one night, if I could go back, I'd say, if I had to guess, I'd say probably around 2010. And some people use the phrase, I was on the weird part of YouTube again. That's probably how I describe it. And I came across a John Titor link. I can't remember exactly what that link was, but kind of went down that rabbit hole, ended up on Oliver Williams' website, which had links to the complete post. And from there, I actually went back to YouTube, listened to a classic Art Bell program on John Titor, which was coincidentally also the first Art Bell show I'd ever listened to. And so you can just imagine how exciting that was for me. And for the next few days, I was going around thinking, oh my God, there's this potentially real time traveler out there. I actually remember I live in Toronto, and I was walking down the street, and this is shortly after I heard about it, and I heard these teenage kids just kind of joking about time travel. And I wouldn't usually do this sort of thing. I don't want to seem like a crank, but I actually stopped these kids, and I was like, have you heard of this guy John Titor? And of course they just thought I was crazy, and they moved on. But yeah, since then I've just been following the story, and each year learning a little bit more about it. And the thing is, I've heard other John Titor enthusiasts say this. It's kind of something that you're into it, and then you kind of put it aside for a while, and then just something new pops up in the news. Maybe somebody related to the story does a radio show, and then suddenly it all starts again. You're into it again, and you spend the next 2 or 3 days obsessing over John Titor again, freaking out your loved ones. So yeah, I guess that's it.
Now, before you learned about John Titor, what was your interest in time travel or space in itself? Did it include UFOs?
Yeah, I'd say I was always into UFOs. Not hardcore. Like I would say that isn't like my principal interest in the paranormal. I think time travel in general has always interested me probably more on a personal level, thinking about what it might mean for me if I was able to access my own past. Particularly, it calls to mind Professor Ronald Mallet, who has been working on time travel so that he could address his deceased father. And nothing so dramatic for me, but I've always been fascinated by the idea of what would happen if I could go back to the past and either observe myself or participate in my own past. And it's actually the theme of a novel I just finished writing called I Ain't Got No Home in This World Anymore. It's about dealing with past versions of yourself, and there are I've actually included most of the time travel like specifications in that novel, as it were, are directly lifted from the John Titor story. I guess we'll get into Larry Haber a little bit later, but I actually contacted Larry Haber and I asked him if that would be okay, and he said yes.
Very interesting indeed, because this is one of those topics that just seems to not go away. We're now 16 years almost into the John Titor story, and we're still learning information about him. That's what I find extremely interesting about this topic. But let's focus more on you. Like when you were growing up, you got your degree in journalism. You're a Ryerson guy, which is one of the top journalism schools in Canada next to BCIT, where I graduated. So I'm going to take credit for that. I know we'll have this rivalry. You're a Blue Jays fan. I'm a Yankees fan. I'm sure that'll come up throughout the night. But the fact is, when you started your journalism career, did you see yourself going down this path, Mike?
No, I didn't. I think so I started out in journalism fairly young. When I was only 15 or 16, I actually got an internship at the Sioux Star, which is my local newspaper, and I did all sorts of the general assignment reporting that an adult reporter might do. So I sort of, this kind of became my identity a little bit, as I'm sure a lot of other journalists might recognize. You call someone on the phone, you say, hi, Mike Sauve, Sioux Star, and you have instant credibility. So, I also, even at that early time, I knew I was very, I read a lot for a teenager, and I knew, so the choice of going to school was either to go to school for English or to go to school for journalism. And at the time I thought, journalism will be the more practical choice because I'll learn like a trade or a skill, which will be, marketable, unlike maybe getting an English degree where, it's not quite so useful. So, I guess in a way the joke was kind of on me because the journalism market has dried up a little bit, and I haven't really, I haven't worked full-time in journalism. I've done a lot of freelance journalism since then. But, I would say my primary focus has always been a little more literary than journalistic. And I would also say that's the paradigm I approach John Titor through, is not so much as a journalist, but as a storyteller who is fascinated by the John Titor story itself.
We are talking with Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio. He's the author of The Wraith of, you're going to have to help me, Scroman, right?
Sure. Yeah, Wraith of Scroman. That's the one that's
there we go. Excellent. And you're a journalist as well, following the John Titor story. Now, you have a story that's going to be coming out in the near future about John Titor.
Yeah, that's correct. I have. It's interesting because my first book that you just mentioned, The Wraith of Scroman, literally just came out last week, so it's just available now. You can get it on Amazon. But I actually have a lot of books in the pipeline. I wrote that one in 2012, and I have 2 more coming out in this year, and one more that I'm currently submitting to agents, and then the one about John Titor that I'm working on now. I actually plan it as a nonfiction ebook. Because I want to kind of dip into those waters. I always felt like I didn't want to get into self-publishing before I had books published by a legitimate publisher first. I wanted that sort of gatekeeper to, validate me in that sense. So now that I have that, I think I want to try to get into especially because this topic, I don't feel it's the most. I don't know if I can approach publishers with a book on John Titor. I don't know how saleable that is, but I do think there's enough interest to justify, that sort of venture. I know Conviction of a Time Traveler, which is a self-published book about John Titor by an anonymous author called Temporal Recon, is an excellent book. And, if I could do something, 1/10 of that quality, I think it would be something to be incredibly proud of.
Mike, when you are deciding to write about John Titor, how do you find your information? Because there is very limited info in regards to this, yet there always seems to be something being leaked out. It's a very much a topic full of quagmire, don't you believe?
You couldn't be more right. You have no idea how right you are, because I actually thought, I started thinking about this project about a month and a half ago, and I thought it would be a short ebook, and I think when we first started talking about doing this radio interview, I actually thought, maybe I'll have it out in time for this interview. And every little thread you pull on in the John Titor story just unravels and goes in all these different directions, and it just and new levels of complexity, and nothing is simple. But a more simple answer, you say, what do I rely on? Anybody looking into the John Titor story has a canonical sort of framework to base their research on, and it's the John Titor posts. So, and I find this time and again, people will comment on the John Titor story, they'll dismiss the John Titor story without having read the post, and that's the biggest mistake you can make, because there is an absolute wealth of information in those posts, and that's basically where you have to begin. Beyond the posts, what my book aims to do, I mentioned Conviction of a Time Traveler a moment ago, and that book, what it does is it makes a lawyerly, almost academic case that John Titor was a time traveler. I'm not dismissing that assertion. Nobody wants that to be true more than me. And my book will address the John Titor story, but what it's also going to do is it's going to look into all the potential suspects of who may have created the John Titor story, if indeed John Titor isn't a time traveler. And for me, that story is as interesting as the actual idea of John Titor being a real time traveler.
We are talking to author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio. You can check out his website, mikesauve.com. Now, I like what you just said in regards to the fact that, you want to believe that John Titor was a true time traveler, but we're still not sure. When you first heard the story, were you more skeptic or more believer?
Oh, I was more believer. I'm always going to be in the more believer camp, just because I think it's more fun to be. I mean, I don't want to be naive about things. I'm not going to pull the wool over my eyes just because I want to believe. But yeah, there was enough in the John Titor story for me to say, okay, there's something more here. Like I said, if he's not a time traveler, there's a lot of privileged information going into this. There's at least several very intelligent people contributing to this. So there's definitely, that's what I find the most annoying is the skeptical person who will look into John Titor. They'll look at what Wikipedia calls predictive failures, meaning the things he predicted that didn't come true, and they just throw the whole thing out because, okay, one of the things John Titor predicted, for example, was American Civil War in 2004. Obviously, that didn't happen. He also predicted a nuclear attack against the U.S. in 2015. Well, it just turned into 2016, and that didn't happen. So these people can just get rid of it then. They say, okay, I'm done thinking about it. Then, that's just not me, because there's enough to the John Titor story where, you can't just dismiss it that easily.
Skeptics will say that, this is just another troll on the internet playing games with people. People want this to happen so bad that there is no way that this could be possible or this could truly be believable. Any type of story like this has a great amount of skepticism to it. Now, when you're discovering the facts, and there's a lot that isn't quite right with his predictions that he put through, do you think the skeptics are sitting there saying, "We told you so"?
Well, I think they probably are, because that's the nature of skeptics, right? They're just happy to be, happy to have won another argument against, a bunch of, they obviously think anyone who buys into things that aren't, rigorously tested and don't appear in scientific journals, that they inherently have no merit, right? And that, they probably treat people that are enthusiastic about those things with the same amount of, credulity with which they would treat people who believe pro wrestling is real, right? That's just the nature of these people. I have no real fondness for this type of person, and so I definitely think that's unfair, and I guess that's what I have to say about that type of perspective on John Titor.
Well, and you know what? I think the validation by the skeptics is a good point, because anybody could play that game. I mean, let's face it, we didn't see the internet trolls as much back then as we do now.
No, and that's
seems
go
ahead.
That's a very good point, because one of the things that fascinates me is we have to think about how different internet culture was in 2000, 2001. I mean, many people were still connecting via dial-up, and an analogy I've made in the book is that, people going on those message boards, you should almost treat them more like someone who's showing up at a conference than someone who's just trolling on Reddit or 4chan today, because they had just a little bit more invested. And what I wanted to say a minute ago was, while there is a lot of skepticism by the posters who are actually interacting with John Titor, it's very respectful, and a lot of times they go out of their way to say, well, you know what, I don't buy this, but this is a very good story, and this guy really has his ducks in a row, and bravo, because you're at least giving us a fun time. And the more hardcore skeptics were coming at John with an incredible level of physics knowledge, and asking him just brain-busting questions that, I have no scientific background. They just make my head swim, essentially. And he's answering these in pretty much real time. There's actually times he was on chat rooms literally answering these questions in real time. So, granted, those people didn't have the predictive failures, but I'm very fascinated by the tone of respect he dealt with. Not always. I mean, at times he would get upset because people would they would ask him the same questions over and over again, or they'd get annoyed because he wouldn't tell them the results of, say, a sporting event. But in general, the tone was pretty high level, I think.
We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio. The topic, time traveler John Titor. MikeSauve.com is his website. One of the things that I like that you pointed out was that John was answering questions. And I do want to get into it, so we might as well start now. In your opinion, if you could describe to our audience, who is John Titor?
Sure. So John Titor, like you said in the intro, showed up around 2000, 2001. He began posting on a website called the Time Travel Institute, and also on Art Bell's BBS at the time, which was called Post to Post. And he basically came right out, and he just said, basically, hello, I'm a time traveler. He gave the specifications of his machine, and probably what bought him almost instant credibility was he said, I don't expect you to believe me. And in fact, this will be more fun if you don't believe me, because if you do believe me, then all this discussion would be about how do you get the specs of my machine so that you can have time travel, right? Because if you think about it, if everyone believed him with 100% certainty, then the government would be hunting him down so that they would then have time travel themselves. So that was very important to John, and I think it also, it bought him a lot of instant credibility. And then he, so you want me to get into the full story now? Yeah,
might as well kick it off here.
Okay, because it's just so interesting, because there's just so many different branches. It's very, I often struggle with how to tell the story in a linear way, but I'll try to give you a smorgasbord of the details that I find most relevant. So he claimed to be from the year 2036, like you mentioned, and I guess his most important mission, as it were, was he returned to, before coming to 2000, He actually came to 1999 first. He went to 1975, and the reason he was chosen for this, he says, is because not only did he have military service and he had the appropriate credentials, but his grandfather was involved in the engineering of the IBM 5100 computer, which had special characteristics that no one actually knew about at this time. It had the ability to read different programming languages, and this is one of the ways that Titor was later validated. We talk about the ways that he was later invalidated, but he said things about this IBM 5100 computer that the engineers of the computer later, when asked, said, yes, it did have these characteristics, and in fact, IBM didn't want people to know because the fact that it could read these different programming languages could actually prevent sales of different models of the computer. So these engineers were, like, one of them is named Bob Dubke, and he was just fascinated by this, that this guy came across, and he said, well, it has to be somebody who was involved with this, was involved in my engineering team, because nobody else would have known this. And later he said, oh, maybe it's not, because he claimed he got a few things wrong. But so yeah, that was the main gist, to get this IBM 5100, because Unix would have a problem, the programming language Unix would have a problem in 2038, and he needed to bring it back to his time to fix this problem. And the Unix 2038 problem, people did know about at the time, but not many. And it's a better example of one of these just small things that anyone could have known, but it's just one of many things that John Titor did know. So it shows that he had this very broad range of knowledge. So to get back to the time of the post, he comes back, 1999, and he calls that personal mission. He says he's there for personal reasons, and he's actually staying with his 3-year-old self, with his mother and father and his 3-year-old self. And he says there's no, we have this concept of, you shake hands with an alternate version of yourself, and reality collapses in on itself or something. But he says this just doesn't happen. This isn't the way it works. And so he's living with his 3-year-old self in that time, and he's saying that his responsibility then is to do archival work, to put together information to bring back to 2036. And he also says that his interaction with the posters on these message boards is also part of his mission.
Very interesting indeed. We're talking with Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio. He's an author and a journalist. His newest book, The Wraith of Scroman. He's also going to be soon writing a book about John Titor, and you can find all his work at mikesauve.com. Mike, we got a couple minutes before we're going to go to break here at the bottom of the hour. It still amazes me that somebody from the future would go all the way back to 1975 to look at that technology, rather than come to the early 2000s where we get into Apple's reintroduction into what they've done with the iPads, iPhones, iPod to kick it off, or Microsoft. So it kind of blows me away.
It's a good point, and it's something I'll give credit to Oliver Williams here, who's the webmaster of one of the more prominent John Titor sites. And what I've heard him point out on interviews is that even recently, NASA would be scouring eBay for old computer parts, because a lot of now I'm not a computer guy, so this is just sort of secondhand information. But a lot of these higher end things are running on ancient technology, and if you think about it, so John Titor's time is post nuclear war, right? So it's not. They do have computers, they do have access to technology, but they wouldn't necessarily have access to everything. And the idea that he might have to go back for something like that, this comes up, and he does manage to make a fairly compelling case as to why it would be necessary to go all the way back.
What about his name, John Titor? Where did that come from? Because I believe that's a pseudonym.
There's a really interesting question where somebody says, one of the posters says, "Is John Titor your real name?" And he says, "Yes, John Titor is a real name." And there's also times where a poster asks him, so John Titor lived in Florida, and a poster said, "I'm looking through this Florida phone book and I can't find John Titor." And he said, "Oh, you're looking at the wrong time." But it has come out later, and we're going to get into Larry Haber and that whole relationship later. But Larry Haber, who's a lawyer who essentially represents the John Titor story, has confirmed that it's a pseudonym. Larry Haber is employed by a woman synonymously named Kay Titor, and he said, yes, that's not her real name. John Titor is not his real name, and yeah, so it is a pseudonym, essentially.
Well, we'll get into that as we come back from break here on the bottom of the hour here of Spaced Out Radio. We are talking John Titor with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. Time travel. Does it exist? Does it not? We'll learn more about it right after this. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. We'll be right back after this break.
This is Patrick Webster Small, and I'm going to bring you the Webster Phenomena right here on Spaced Out Radio, Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific Time. Every week, I'm going to bring you the freshest information on the globe. I'm bringing you guys the truth, extraterrestrials in the sky, prophecy, chemtrails, rainbow spot, the seventh angel, biblical skies, ancient gods, ghosts, spirits, see it, hear it. So let's do this every Monday night. I'll see you back here at 8 p.m. Pacific Time.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Did you know that Spaced Out Radio is live 7 days a week? This is Jim Tyson, host of Spaced Out Weekend. You can listen to my show, Spaced Out Weekend, every Saturday and Sunday night starting at 1 a.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Pacific. On Spaced Out Weekend, we like to delve into the paranormal, even the newest technologies that have enhanced modern-day ghost hunting. And sometimes, we'll get a little creative and dabble into the crypto world, UFOs, and much, much more. So tune in at www.spacedoutradio.com on the weekends and listen to me, Jim Tyson, on Spaced Out Weekend.
Hi there, this is Jolene with Rivulet Reiki and Readings, and I want you to relax. Let me help you chill out and get in touch with your body, mind, and soul. In this busy world, sometimes we need to let go, and this is where I can help. Visit my website, rivuletrndr.wix.com/rivuletrndr, or my Facebook page, Rivulet R&R, to set up an appointment for relaxation, Reiki, or readings, no matter where you are. Spaced Out Radio listeners will also receive 10% off their first visit. It's time for you to make time for you.
The Spaced Out Radio Network can be found at spacedoutradio.com. Hi there, this is Dave Scott. Here you can join the latest on our weekly shows and news from around the world involving UFOs, cover-ups, cryptids, ghosts, and more. Read articles from our very talented staff and check out our weekly tarot card reading from Psychic Catherine. You can also sign up for free on our forum and tell us about your experiences. SpacedOutRadio.com. Always live, always interactive.
Ready to find out what's flying up in the sky? Me too. Hi there, this is Rich Giordano. Please join me every Sunday night at 7 for the AZ UFO Show. It's a fast and compelling 2-hour show on UFOs, extraterrestrials, conspiracy theories, and much more. Every week we will have great guests and great topics to try and answer the ultimate question, are we alone in this universe or not? So tune in to the AZ UFO Show with me, Rich Giordano, right here on the Spaced Out Radio Network at spacedoutradio.com.
Would you like to connect with Dave and his guests? Learn more at spacedoutradio.com for the latest news, features, photos, and articles. Spacedoutradio.com is where you can stay up to date on what's happening around the world and up in the stars. And now, back to Dave Scott.
Thank you so much for joining us tonight on Spaced Out Radio as we talk time travel about John Titor with author Mike Sauve. Before we bring Mike back on, I do want to remind you, you can follow us at Spaced Out Radio. You can give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can also join our Spaced Out Radio group, as well as our other group, Podcast Central. On Instagram, you can follow me at Dave Scott SOR, and spacedoutradio.com has our free forum, as well as a great list of shows and information. Tomorrow night show, it's going to be interesting indeed. We will be joined by Kathy Sullivan-Walden, or Kelly Sullivan-Walden, rather. Sorry about that. And we will be talking what dreams actually mean. It'll be a good show tomorrow night on Spaced Out Radio. And I want to say a quick shout-out to fans listening in the Space Out Radio chat room. Remember, if you have a question, type them in capital letters, so that way I can get the questions to our guests. And we want to thank our fans for listening at paranormalforum.net. Again, we bring in Mike Sauve, his website, mikesauve.com. He's an author and a journalist. We were talking time travel and John Titor. Now, Mike, right before the break, we were talking about John Titor living with his future self. What kind of information is out there in regards to that?
Well, it comes directly from the posts where it happens quite often. He'll mention it. I think when he first started posting, his former self was 2, and then he was 3 by the time he'd finished posting. So, there's and again, it's like he said the child didn't really have a sense of who he was. His parents knew who he was, but and it apparently wasn't a big deal in many ways to Titor.
Now, when he met his future self, you had mentioned earlier in the show that apparently you weren't supposed to meet your future self because that could send everything spiraling on what was going to happen into the future. But John apparently said it didn't work like that. That's surprising to me.
Yeah, he did say that. And he also said there's a quote, I was just looking for it, I'm not finding it, but it basically said, like, it says something about us that we have this belief that we couldn't do it, and it's almost as if we don't like ourselves in a way. It almost sounds a little like New Agey, which John could be sometimes. Every once in a while he sounded a little bit of a philosopher, and that was sort of his message there, that, maybe that's not so much, this hard and fast rule of the universe so much as something that, our modern consciousness projects onto the idea of time travel. The question came, there's a scene in the movie Time Cop where the one of the time travelers shakes hands with himself, and it's like all hell breaks loose. And that's how the poster phrased it to John. And John dismissed it out of hand. Because essentially, I mean, this is a big topic, but John's method of time travel, if you think of time travel in a movie like Time Cop or in most popular fiction, it involves going back on a linear world line, right? And where you'll be on the same world line you were born on, everything will happen the same. John's time travel is more in line with, contemporary quantum physics, where and also based on something called the many worlds interpretation. So essentially believes in parallel universes. There's an infinite number of universes, and John said that so you can time travel to any of these, but by necessity you would want to go to one that was as similar to yours as possible, as free of divergence. So he said that the world line he went to, or our world line, was 2.5% divergence from his. So a sports result might be different. Something. Small things would happen differently, but essentially everything important was the same. Whereas if, say, you went to a world with 1,000 divergence, maybe the sky would be green and the air would be unbreathable for you. So, yeah, in a sense, this isn't John Titor's original. John Titor is from a timeline or parallel universe 2.5 degrees removed from ours. So there's no reason there can't be 2 John Titors on our timeline where the time traveler John Titor arrived. You can see how this gets tricky semantically sometimes talking about.
No, absolutely in regards to it. Now, when he found his family in Florida, did he ever explain how he found them, or was it just from memory of where he grew up?
Yeah, I don't think that came up. I think he does talk a little bit about dealing with them. And there's a quote from his mother that his mother told to Larry Haber about, like, a mother just knows, right? So you can imagine if some relative of yours who's now like 30 years older shows up and says, "Hi, I'm your relative," and yeah, a mother knows. And he said the most interesting thing he said about his family was that his father did believe that he was a time traveler, did believe that he was his son, but he couldn't bring himself to believe that John's time travel unit, which is called a temporal displacement unit, was real. Like, for whatever reason, John's father maybe had a bit of the skeptic in himself. He was able to accept that this person was his son, but not that that this machine could possibly travel through time.
Did he ever decipher if there were any confirmations into how he convinced the family that this was their son of the future? Like, did the young child that he met have any maybe birthmarks or any type of scars that they could show one another to say, hey, this is real? You see, the scar on my face is the same as the young lad here.
Yeah, to my knowledge, there's nothing tangible physically like you're suggesting. What there was would have been just relaying personal history, and I don't think there's a lot of detail about that, but he does talk about he does get into life with his parents and what he thinks of. So if you can imagine going back to when you were 3 years old, you wouldn't have much conscious recollection. So John's psyche came into fruition in the middle of this civil war that he talks about. So little things like, he says at one point he breaks down crying when he goes into a superstore because there's so much abundance, and that just like breaks his heart that there's so much food in one place. He says, the first time I walked into a superstore, I cried. I'd never seen so much excess in one place at one time. And there are these little details about living with his family. Another example is, he talks about they're driving along the highway and they see someone whose car is broken down and they have a gas can. And John asks his parents, why aren't we helping this guy? And they say, well, he could be crazy, he could be a serial killer or whatever. And John can't reconcile that because in the future that John lives in, post-nuclear war, it's very much like frontier days. Everyone has to chip in, everyone has to help each other. So there are these little glimpses into John's life with his family, but primarily, if you think about, if you were interacting with a time traveler on these message boards, what the questions are about, there's a lot of physics nerds asking him hardcore physics questions. There's a lot of people asking him, like I mentioned, who won this sports game? Prove it to me, right? So the one person, though, there's a prominent poster named Pamela. And Pamela is very interesting because John apparently gave her a secret song. And so Pamela is this like crucial figure to the whole thing. But what's interesting about Pamela is she would ask more emotion-based questions. What is, like, how does this affect your psyche? And so through the Pamela questions, which to the best of my knowledge appeared more on the Time Travel Institute post than on the post-to-post ones, you get more of a human picture of John Titor than you do from the Art Bell fans.
I'll get into Pamela in just a moment because I think that's a very intriguing part of this story. But getting back to his family, did Big John ever introduce himself to Little John as I'm you?
Yeah, I think he said, again, he was 2 and 3, so I'm not sure how, cognizant he would have been in that sort of thing. But, and again, there's not a ton of posts about this, but the general sense is there's never any effort to hide that. And it wasn't something that, it didn't seem to be a bone of contention. But, again, fortunately, or unfortunately rather, there might be a bit of a dearth of those types of questions and more of the types of questions I was describing earlier. So we have these certain paradigm through which, we're forced to view John Titor through the questions that were asked at the time.
We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. His website, MikeSauve.com. That's SAUVE.com. We're talking time travel and John Titor. Now, his lawyer, Larry Haber, has he ever spoken publicly about this in regards to this story being real? And what has he said if he has?
He has. Larry Haber is a fascinating case, fascinating aspect to the John Titor story. Larry Haber first came on the scene around 2004, and his claim is that a law school friend. First of all, Larry Haber is an entertainment lawyer who lives and works in Florida, and he's a legitimate lawyer, has a legitimate practice, does work with Universal and Disney, and he says a law school friend of his who he hadn't seen since law school approached him on behalf of this woman, the pseudonymous Kay Titor, and the purpose of this was to publish the book John Titor, A Time Traveler's Tale, which is nothing but the complete post of John Titor. So Larry Haber was contracted to do this, and Larry Haber is so fascinating because the vibe he gives off is exactly what you'd expect if he were just a regular lawyer who was contracted to do this. He seems a little bit bemused. He'll frequently say, I have a full practice and this is just one small case that came. But meanwhile, it takes up, people are so much more interested in this than they are about his day-to-day practice. So if the John Titor story is not the story of a real time traveler, then you have to assume that Larry Haber is in some way critical to the telling of this story. I find it very difficult to believe that there would be a consortium of authors behind this story, and they would go out and hire someone external to their consortium. So I believe if you view it through the paradigm that John Titor is not a time traveler, then you have to assume that Larry Haber is in some way a part of the group behind the John Titor story. And another thing that's interesting is he often says, like, this isn't my life, and Oliver Williams, the John Titor webmaster I mentioned earlier, has even said that there are people who are fanatical about John Titor who would give death threats to Larry Haber's son, and so this is pretty heavy stuff. But he doesn't necessarily, as much as he is, like I said, bemused and doesn't, he tries to say it's not a big part of his life, he doesn't go out of his way to distance himself from it either. Like as recently as last year, right around this time, he appeared on the Jimmy Church radio show, and it seems what he's doing is serving to fan the flames of the John Titor story, which is the same thing I can say about every prominent person in the John Titor story. So it becomes so fascinating to me trying to pin down the connections between these people. And we'll get into some of the other people later, I'm sure, but Larry Haber is the Rosetta Stone. All roads sort of go through Larry Haber, essentially, when you're talking about, post John Titor, post 2000, 2001. This is a whole other can of worms, but there was a YouTube video posted by Larry Haber that he says came from the family, and it was essentially John Titor giving coordinates to other John Titors, and this was like the big John Titor news of a few years ago. So every time, it's like we can't get really new John Titor developments unless they come from Larry Haber. So you can't really be into the John Titor story without being into who is Larry Haber, and even Larry Haber's family. Like Larry Haber's son, his name is Brandon. He's done worked for NASA, and people speculate that he is behind the John Titor story. Even though, in my estimation, I'm not sure of his exact age, but he's around my age, which would be late 20s, early 30s. He would have been quite young, so I have a hard time implicating him. There was an Italian documentary series called Voyager, and they implicated Larry Haber's brother, who. And this is very confusing because sometimes you'll hear him referred to as John Rick Haber, but I believe his name is Maury Haber, and Maury Haber works in IT security. So already, I can feel how you can just see how this thing kind of goes out like a spider web, right? And this is just the Haber family. I could keep going like this for a few minutes, actually.
Well, I think it's very interesting to get into Larry Haber a little bit more because it sounds like he's representing John Titor, but do we know if he's still representing the family? Because if this story is true, little Titor would be between the age of 18 and 21 right now, would he not?
Yeah, he sure would. And the only way we have to know that Larry Haber is representing the family is Larry Haber's word. And quite frankly, Larry Haber is someone I would be inclined to take at his word. He seems like, I have Larry Haber as a friend on Facebook. He seems like an upstanding family man. He's definitely a professional. So this is what's so confounding to me. I can't understand why someone as esteemed as Larry Haber would just throw his reputation on the line to just engage in some hoax. It doesn't seem characteristic of someone like Larry Haber. So that brings me back to thinking, well, then maybe it has to be real. So it kind of feels like you're on some kind of spinning around like a hamster in a cage or something between the two different ways of thinking. John Titor is real. John Titor is I don't like to use the word hoax, actually, because there's a negative connotation. I like to say, it's a story or it's a narrative or it's fiction. So, yeah, Larry Haber also, probably the most interesting Larry Haber interview he did on Coast to Coast, and he acted as a go-between between George Noory and Kay Titor, and they edited it because she didn't want to appear on the air. So what would happen is George Noory would ask a question, Larry Haber would put the phone down, ask Kay Titor, and then he would say her response back to George. So they cut out the silences. But that's where we get the information that Kay Titor says, like, a mother would know her own son. That's all that it took to prove it to him. So yeah, I mean, Larry Haber, I could just rack my brains like all night and day trying to say is and the other thing about Larry Haber is he's very he doesn't have to be interacting with various John Titor enthusiasts, but he does. Like, there's a Facebook group, John Titor, the physics behind time travel, and Larry Haber's a member, but he's not like an active member. He's not the guy posting stuff all the time. But every once in a while, someone will say, "Hey, Larry, can you confirm this?" And he'll just write like yes or no, like exactly like you might expect a busy lawyer to treat just one small facet of his practice. So yeah, Larry Haber and the whole Haber family fascinates me. There was also it was a YouTube series. I think it might have been called Searching for John Titor, but it was basically some amateur YouTube sleuths who were trying to track down John Titor, and eventually, they get Larry Haber and a man who's introduced as John Rick Haber, who I think is Maury Haber. That's all very confusing. I'm still never 100% sure about that. And Brandon Haber. Larry does all the talking, and the main gist of the interview seems to be he wants to get the heat off the John Rick / Maury guy, because apparently it was affecting his career a little bit, where this guy works in IT security, and when you Google him, all that comes up is John Titor. And so that seemed to be the focus of that and why he came forward there. So it's fascinating how he comes forward every once in a while, and when he does, for John Titor enthusiasts, it's kind of like an event. Like if you hear Larry Haber, like when I heard Larry Haber was going to be on Jimmy Church, it's a big deal, right? Because it's gonna mean new information about John Titor, essentially.
Well, if young little Titor is now 18 to 21 years old, this would mean that he should be in the military right now.
Well, that's the thing is that John's not all of John's predictions came true, and I hope soon we'll get into some of his predictions that did come true, because that's where it gets really fascinating. But yeah, the idea is that John Titor's world line and ours have a divergence, and this is why it's easy to dismiss. But there's also the possibility that John Titor made changes to our world line that caused what happened on his not to happen. And maybe it'd be a good time to get into just exactly what John Titor did say happened on his world line. Like I mentioned earlier, said Civil War broke out in 2004, and it wasn't so much Democrats, Republicans as cities and states. And a lot of John Titor's posts are very constitutionalist. They're very anti-big government. And this is where, when you look at some of the people who are into John Titor, you can see those same traits in them, and you think, well, maybe that person was behind it. But, so those things that he said to happen, didn't happen to his 3-year-old self. Obviously, he's probably like living just a normal life in high school right now. But I guess the woman, it would make sense if you think about it, that if this all really did happen, that it would be his mother who's tasked with kind of doing whatever he had said he wanted done.
Did John Titor ever ask, or was he ever asked, I should rephrase, about time travel? Because we have heard people, most notably Andrew Bashago from Seattle, a Seattle lawyer, who said he was a young chrononaut in his younger age, and yet that would have been in the 60s and 70s, late 60s into the 70s into the 80s. Now, did John Titor ever mention about time travel currently or when it started?
Yeah, he never mentioned Baggiago, that's for sure, and I don't think Baggiago would have been in the discourse at that point. I'm not sure if he said exactly when it started, but there is a sort of narrative that goes throughout the posts where he says it. So in 2000 he says that things will start happening at CERN in about a year, and now. I was like 17, so I wasn't hearing about CERN at the time, but not as many people were talking about CERN as they were now, and not as many people. So there's a whole science, that involves Tipler sinusoids and Kerr black holes, and pretty much like hardcore, quantum physics stuff that John Titor. A lot of the posts are like intense details like this, describing how his machine works. And, so he does time and again. People ask him these questions. And time and again, these people are generally impressed by his answers. They say, and that's what sort of, if the John Titor story is fake, this guy he had all this, information that was available. You couldn't technically know this stuff, but not many people knew it. And then when you take every example of something like that he knew about, and it's across not just physics, but a range of fields, then you think, who is this guy, or who are these people, more accurately? Because if it was one guy, it was a pretty brilliant person. And they also had this storytelling ability, right? They also had, that's why sometimes in various articles, sometimes the science fiction author David Brin is mentioned as being behind it, possibly because he wrote the foreword to a book called Alas, Babylon, which shares some thematic elements to John Titor's story.
We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio. We're talking time travel. Mike's website is mikesauve.com, and we are specifically talking John Titor tonight. So with the predictions that John started making, how many of them actually came true? Let's talk about the positives here that have come true before we get into the negatives, because we also have to remember that his predictions are made on an alternate timeline, and that has to be made very important.
My favorite prediction is one. So again, there was something that was very important to John, and it was that he wouldn't tell anything that would allow people to avoid death by probability. He wouldn't tell people things that were going to potentially change the world line for others. So it was important to John not to reveal these things. So when he does reveal things, he's quite sly about it. And my favorite one is because it seems like the perfect thing. If you don't want to, warn people about, a tsunami or something. So at one point, somebody, I don't know if you remember this, but because I didn't, and I only learned about it later. But around this time, there was something called Project Ginger, and it was being very heavily marketed, and it was a mystery what Project Ginger was. And nobody, so very few people would have known. And what Project Ginger ended up being was the Segway. Familiar with the Segway, the standing, motorized device. It's kind of become silly now, but at the time,
absolutely.
Yeah. And so John kind of just slyly answers that when he says, "Oh, it's a sort of like a motorized cart." So he knew what Project Segway was going to yield. Now, I've referenced Conviction of a Time Traveler before. He devotes several pages to this, and he looks at how a person could have known this. And the only way a person could have known this is if they dug through all these patents, did what would have been just an incredible amount of work, and he answered the question in a very short period of time. So that bodes very well for John. And some of the other predictions are broader. Like for example, somebody asked him what entertainment is like at his time, and he essentially describes like YouTube perfectly. He says most of it is over the internet. People do it in small groups, and looking back, it says, okay, well, of course it would have been over the internet, but there's all these things he gets sort of right. He also gets when asking about the internet, he says, oh, it's wireless nodes now, kind of like your cell phones, which of course this is how internet service is now provided. So it's little things.
No, I understand that, and everything has to be taken with a grain of salt into what the predictions are due to the timeline. And I think, once again, I have to point that out because one of the things, if we look towards the negative side of the predictions, I mean, he said there was going to be another world war in 2015. Well, we just went through 2015, and there was no so-called world war. However, it could percolate to the mess that is happening in the Middle East with countries like Russia and China now jumping on board of what happened there. So, I mean, technically, how far do we stretch it to see whether or not his predictions came true?
People have stuck to that for some time, and people who share John Titor's worldview, people who are anti-small government, people who are constitutionalists, tend to be able to draw from his posts and say, well, this is happening, and they do believe that. And there are some people. There was a line of thinking that I've come across where people say everything is just a little bit backdated, which John felt it necessary to do. Like, so the Civil War, which was supposed to be 2004, maybe actually starts 2015. But of course, that's a slippery slope, and probably opens them up to dissension from your skeptic type, because of course we could just keep saying that forever, a little bit like apocalypse promoters, right? Oh well, it's actually going to be next month, right? So yeah, it's always a fine line where do you want to, how much, there are areas where he does deserve all this credence, and then there are areas where you should say, well, maybe it didn't happen. So yeah.
We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. His website, MikeSauve.com, if you want to check it out. He just had a book release as well called The Wraith of Scroman. You might want to pick that up. I believe that's on Amazon right now, Mike?
Yeah, that's right. Just type in The Wraith of Scroman, or just type in my name. You'll probably find it.
Absolutely perfect. So give that one a shot as well. Mike, we're going to take our second break of the night. When we come back, let's learn about John Titor's future life that he told back in 2000, 2001. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. We'll be right back after this break.
The Phoenix Lights, Roswell, secret military aircraft, flying saucers. Let's check out the sky together. Hi, this is Rich Giordano, host of the AZ UFO Show right here on the Spaced Out Radio Network. Every Sunday night at 7, we hit the airwaves to talk about the phenomenon of unidentified flying objects and more. We want to hear your stories. Maybe you've seen what many others have seen. Only one way to find out, the AZ UFO Show on Sunday nights on the Spaced Out Radio Network on spacedoutradio.com.
Hi there, this is James Tyson, host of Spaced Out Weekends, and I know you're enjoying tonight's show with Dave Scott on Spaced Out Radio. I just wanted to remind you that Spaced Out Radio continues on the weekends with me. On Spaced Out Weekend, we hit the airwaves at www.spacedoutradio.com starting at 10 p.m. Pacific, 1 a.m. Eastern. We have great guests with interesting chats regarding all things paranormal, supernatural, cryptozoological, and much, much more. So tune in to Spaced Out Weekend and give us a listen.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
Need a break but don't have the time? Tired of life's running around? Hi, this is Jolene from Relaxation and Readings. Let me help you in your time of need. From Reiki to Realm Readings, I can help provide you therapy for your mind, body, and soul. Check out my website at rivuletrr.wix.com/rivuletrr. And if you're a listener of Spaced Out Radio, receive 10% off your first session. Rivulet Relaxation and Readings. And don't forget to give my Facebook page a like. It's time for you to make some important time for you.
The Spaced Out Radio Network can be found at spacedoutradio.com. Hi there, this is Dave Scott. Here you can join the latest on our weekly shows and news from around the world involving UFOs, cover-ups, cryptids, ghosts, and more. Read articles from our very talented staff and check out our weekly tarot card reading from Psychic Catherine. You can also sign up for free on our forum and tell us about your experiences. SpacedOutRadio.com. Always live, always interactive.
The Webster Phenomena airs on Spaced Out Radio. on Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific Time. I'm your host, Patrick Webster Small, and I discovered extraterrestrials in the atmosphere, which led me to more discoveries, developing the Webster phenomena, which is the occurrence of extraterrestrials throughout nature. I will explain the Webster phenomena and all my recent discoveries every Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific Time, right here on Spaced Out Radio.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
Want to call in to Spaced Out Radio? You can. 1-607-203-5344. You can tweet us at Spaced Out Radio or send us a message on Facebook at Spaced Out Radio. And now, back to the show. Here's Dave Scott.
A great shout-out to all the people in the Space Out Radio chat room and at paranormalforum.net. Thank you so much for joining us live during the show and chatting about our broadcast. I love it. If you want to follow us on social media, you do so on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. You give our Facebook a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can also ask to join our Spaced Out Radio group and our Podcast Central group. On Instagram, I can be found at Dave Scott, SOR. And, of course, spacedoutradio.com is our free forum site, as well as our schedule for upcoming shows. Tomorrow night on the show, Kelly Sullivan-Walden will join us. We are going to be discussing dreams. Before we get to her, we got another hour of this one to go. Mike Sauve is our guest. He's an author and journalist. MikeSauve.com is his website. You can also find his latest book on Amazon, The Wraith of Scroman. But tonight we're talking about time travel, more importantly, John Titor. Now, Mike, right before the break, we started talking about the predictions that John was making. Now, a lot of them didn't come true, and we have to assume that's because, as you said, the timeline was off by 2.5 degrees. So obviously what happened in his timeline growing up isn't going to happen here. But
right, or the possibility that John did something to make our timeline unfold differently out of, altruism, so that the horror that he experienced wouldn't happen to us.
That is an interesting point indeed in regards to how he would have done that. Would Larry Haber, the family lawyer, know what he did to maybe try and change that timeline?
No, I don't think Larry would know that, because Larry, again, or at least Larry would tell you he wouldn't know that, because Larry takes a very casual approach. Like, Larry is not a John, to the best of my knowledge, like a John Titor completist. He's not like going on these sites because he is fascinated by John Titor. He's going because he's become entrenched in it through, according to his story, through no real action of his own. It was just sort of thrust into his lap.
But this is where the skeptics really come out and say there's no way that this guy should be making predictions because none of them have come true. Because, it's always a blanket statement when it comes to, say, a 50-50 split on the predictions. And there's another poster. Sorry, go ahead.
Sorry. Okay. And there's certainly predictions that are easy enough to say that anyone could have made them. Like, for example, there will be trouble in the Middle East, right? That's not, you don't need to be Svengali to suggest that in the future there's going to be trouble in the Middle East. There is one that's quite good. Someone asked John if he remembered any poetry, and he said that he remembered a poem called A Soldier's Winter. And here's what John said about that. He said, "The trees," this is the poem that he recalls, "the day before it wasn't snowing. The trees are strangers, leering, disapproving in the ash of winter. My world, my life, my wandering path. I pray God's eyes may once again gaze upon me and remind me that I am still his child." And he says that this poem was written by a soldier in the military, and that it was added to over subsequent years by other writers. Now, there are currently 3 poems online that you can find called A Soldier's Winter. 2 of them, I would say, were written, in my estimation, by just John Titor fans. They contain a lot of these lines, and you look at the authors. There's not a real provenance, as you might say. There's not. You can't trace these people back. They're not poets. But there is one. It's called A Soldier's Winter, and it's by retired Army Colonel Larry Cluck. And this, if you use the Wayback Machine, you can find it in 2005. You can also find a self-published book by Larry Cluck, which I'm assuming contains this poem. I haven't ordered it, but I won't read the whole thing, but it starts with the line, "The day before it wasn't snowing," and then some of the lines are similar, but just a little different, which makes perfect sense, because if John is recalling this poem, he wouldn't get it all perfectly right. And this Larry Cluck, he's been approached. I believe Oliver Williams approached him, and he said, "No, I have no knowledge of this John Titor guy. This is interesting to me, but I don't know." And again, so now if John Titor is fake, this Larry Cluck individual must be in on it. So we've got another person who either has to be in on it or is just somehow, a puppet for the people who are in on it. So yeah, there's probably the one of the more fascinating ones, and that's when Oliver Williams says that, I almost sometimes this is the interesting thing about John Titor is it makes you a little bit paranoid about everyone. It kind of sometimes I feel writing this like I'm living in a Pynchon novel. First of all, because everybody has made up or funny names like Temporal Recon. They don't go by their real names. And second, everything seems to be sort of weirdly interconnected, where I feel like, and sort of I'm diverging a bit from the question, but I sometimes feel like Oliver Williams, who's again that webmaster, he frequently appears on Coast to Coast, or has frequently appeared on Coast to Coast. I almost feel like he sounds like a salesman for the story sometimes. It's almost like Oliver Williams, the story is so brilliant. Oliver Williams wants to remind you of everything that's so good about it. It kind of reminds me of like an author selling his book, right? It has this, it has this, it has this. Or maybe Oliver Williams is just really into it. I don't know.
One of the ones that really interested me that came to fruition was his predictions about both Russia and China not having any real problems, but becoming real world powers and somewhat taking over the power of the United States on the world stage.
Yeah, and if you think about at that time, 2000, 2001, Russia was still not anything near the power they are today. They were still recovering from the Cold War, and that would not have been a popular opinion then. I guess you, skeptic, could argue if you were a student of international relations, you could effectively posit that Russia would mount a recovery, that it was inevitable. But that's another good one, and that's another example of these broader predictions. They're not going to they're not slam dunk argument winners, but they sure are. They sort of add up. If you like, I'm actually holding Temporal Recon's book here, Conviction of a Time Traveler, and on the last page, he just lists about a dozen bullet points of things that, and which throughout the book he makes the case that came true. I think I should just read them quickly because it'll be a nice, concise way to sort of list everything that he did get. So he correctly guessed, and again I'm quoting Conviction of a Time Traveler here, he correctly guessed that Project Ginger was a type of scooter. He correctly guessed the advent of wireless internet. He correctly guessed the advent of video and music file sharing. He correctly guessed the sociological impact of personal videos on the internet, creating a form of live theater. He correctly guessed the existence and special characteristics of the IBM 5100. Correctly guessed the advent of online availability of literature, the advent of voice over internet protocol, the name of the poem A Soldier's Winter, the creation of a European army, the invention of optical measurement for atomic clocks, that there would be a second Gulf War, that there was a problem with WMD being found in Iraq, and that man-caused global warming was not happening. That one is disputable. I think that's more Temporal Recon's perspective. And then this second last one here, he correctly guessed there would be a missing skyscraper in New York City. And that was actually not from the Post, but from, see, this is how, again, the narrative is kind of convoluted. Before 2000 and 2001, there was a fax to Art Bell in 1998. And it's just a little bit different than the rest of the John Titor story. But that's one of the predictions there. So this again feeds into, if John Titor wasn't real, maybe that fax was a sort of trial run, or if John Titor was real, maybe that fax was from even an alternate John Titor, and I can sense how this might be getting confusing, but that's again something that video that Larry Haber talks about. He talks about there being multiple John Titors and needing to have content on the internet as a sort of roadmap to help them get back to their original world lines. Sorry, I hate to go all over the place on you, but this is the nature of the John Titor story.
No, I understand that, and I think I'm like a lot of my listeners right now who are just trying to, cut and paste and glue and put the puzzle pieces together, because this story, it bounces around so much, and there's so many different arms off this John Titor octopus that
for sure.
it goes in so many different directions, and it's tough to keep a hold of. But there were times that he was quite specifically wrong. Okay, he said that there would be no longer any Olympics after 2004 because of tensions around the world. That obviously didn't come true, especially with China hosting the 2008 Winter Olympics, or Summer Olympics, pardon me. So, I mean, there are predictions like that really show that, he wasn't all there in regards to being accurate.
No, and I think if he was totally accurate, we'd probably be living in some crazy society where we are all obsessed with John Titor, right? I think it's because there's enough there to keep people kind of, to keep your more rationally oriented people at bay, yet, like we've been discussing, there's enough going on that, so again, my paradigm is that even if John Titor is not real, whoever is behind John Titor is equally fascinating, because whoever these people are, they haven't made a dime. Nobody has come forward to capitalize on this in any way. Clearly, a lot of intellectual capital went into this. One thing we haven't had a chance to discuss is the drawings. John Titor provided not only pictures of his time machine, but a very high-level pull-out drawing of how it works. And this is something Jimmy Church talks about extensively. This is not something that you could just bang out in Illustrator. This is something that, a technical drawing that probably take a competent draftsman several days or serious man hours to put together. So if this wasn't something that a real time traveler had, this was something that somebody invested a lot of intellectual and financial capital in doing. So it works for me either way. I don't just say, okay, the Olympics didn't happen, let's throw this out, who cares?
I did find it funny that when I was doing my research for this show, that originally Stephen Hawking had really clashed with the ideas around black holes and contemporary understandings of how they work. John Titor had described it a different way, but in 2004, Mr. Hawking actually revised his theory, bringing it in line with what Titor had said.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good one. And I mean, again, I'm not a physics guy. I guess, I'll just play devil's advocate here and say maybe how you could refute that is you might be able to say that while Hawking didn't feel that way, maybe that was still a theory that existed, right? It was like a competing theory. But again, it's just one more kind of one more thing on the pile to say, well, wow, And that's something Oliver Williams brings up all the time, too. Oliver Williams is a big fan of that point, so.
I have a question from Marlena in the Space Out Radio chat room. Okay. And she is one of my favorite listeners, but she's also a big skeptic as well. She asks some pretty tough questions. So she's asking, for any predictions prior to 2036, did John Titor give any information about what would happen and be verified when we reach 2036, like the name of a president or something that no one else could know from that time because we haven't been there yet?
Well, he laid out a whole complex narrative, so there are definitely specific things. So if she's looking for hard things, so for example, he said that so there was a civil war between the rural and the big cities, and he said the big cities would go on to be called the American Federal Empire. So there's just one example. They're called the American Federal Empire, right? He didn't so much name presidents, but he did give a lot of specific political information. He said that Instead, there would actually go on to be, instead of the current political system in the U.S., there would be 5 presidents, sitting presidents, and they would actually be elected in at different times. So something I'm sure we're going to get into, but the most vivid and the most detail-rich part of the John Titor story is what the future is like, because people asked a lot of questions about it, and he never failed to give good answers. And this is where we've talked about how John Titor impressed all these physics people. This is where, as a writer of fiction, John Titor impresses me, because he weaves this story in real time that is like very evocative and touching. Like there's an emotional depth to it, where he describes going through these wars and he joined a shotgun militia when he was 13 years old, so his whole adolescence was spent in this turmoil, and he sounds exactly like someone who would have gone through that. So now we've got a guy, again, coming from the paradigm that John Titor isn't real. Now we have a guy who has all this physics knowledge, is, getting, saying what Stephen Hawking would later say, like you just mentioned. But he's also telling a story, just beautifully, right? And that's why David Brin is sometimes mentioned as being involved, or some fiction author. So if we have a consortium, you've got the physics guy, and you've probably got the talented sci-fi writer as well.
Marlena has a follow-up question to you then. If someone can come back from the future, does that mean that the future then has already happened?
Yes, it would mean that the future had already happened. And under the many worlds interpretation, which, I'm not like I said, I don't lecture in physics or anything, everything is happening at once. Everything that can possibly happen will happen and has happened. So it's essentially all things are existing at once. And I would urge anyone who's into that side of the John Titor story, some things they might want to look up would be, like I said, the many worlds interpretation and the John Everett-Wheeler model. And these areas are the sort of the bedrock of John Titor's sort of time travel, the hard science behind it.
We are talking to author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. He's the author of The Wraith of Scromen. He is also a big John Titor researcher as time travel and John Titor on Spaced Out Radio. His website is MikeSauve.com. Marlena is filling up the questions here, and I absolutely love it when she does this. She's saying, how much of the future, then, do we know has happened, or has the end of time already occurred?
This is actually a very interesting question, because I forget the exact year, but John Titor says they can go into the future, and there's a certain time at which there's nothing. And I forget exactly what year it was. If I had to guess, I would say it's I could be wrong. I hate to guess. I feel like it's like 6,000-ish, but again, I could be wrong. But anyways, it's like at least several centuries, maybe a few thousand years in the future, where there's just nothing, and that the minds behind time travel at that time are trying to figure out why this is. Like, no matter what world line they go to, it's just void, essentially. So that's not very promising. That's kind of terrifying, actually.
It is. I typed in right before I read that to you, I typed in deep question, because, that is a deep question, and it's a scary question when you think about it. Going back to the Space Out Radio chat room, Wayne has a question. Did John Titor drive back to Florida to jump to 1999 after retrieving the 5100 in Minnesota in 75?
Did he drive back to Florida? That I can't say for certain. There is a lot of detail about his vehicles. He at one point, he had a Corvette, I think, and he talks about the suspension necessary. And at one point, he sells the Corvette and he gets a four-wheel drive vehicle. And there's a lot of detail he gives about how the temporal distortion unit works relative to the vehicle it's stored in, but I can't recall if he drove back from Florida after. I don't even really recall where the engineers were located. I do know a lot of the narrative revolves around Florida, which is pretty fascinating. Larry Haber is based in Florida. John Titor is based in Florida. Oliver Williams is based in Florida. So there's definitely a lot of Florida going on in this narrative.
I'm just surprised he's not a snowbird with all the Canadians that go down there to Florida, to vacation during the winter. I'm trying to inject a little bit of bad humor into that, but what can I say?
I see your bad humor, and I'll raise you one, because there's actually a John Titor quote about Canada, and I have it right here. He says, "I've noticed that when most Americans think about Canada in this time, they think about pine trees, chooks," I don't know what he means by that, "and back bacon. It may interest you to know that most Canadians in 2036 are some of the most efficient, ruthless, and dangerous people I know. God help Quebec."
That's just because probably the Montreal Canadiens haven't won a Stanley Cup up until then.
Could be.
That's what I'm going to put on there. I'll use a little hockey reference, or they're still pissed off about their Expos leaving. Who knows?
Yeah,
who knows?
It just goes to show you, though, John Titor story, a little something for everybody. Like you can get I encourage everyone who's interested in this story to just get the post. Like, they're available at PDF. You just spend a few minutes Googling, and you can find the complete post. And then just read them. I mean, there's a couple different versions. There's versions that are just what John Titor says, which are useful, and then there's a longer version, which is every question asked him. And that one runs, it's not formatted too well, but it runs several hundred pages. So there's a lot there. And then if you have a specific question, you can just kind of use the search function in Word, and a lot of it, you'll find a lot of what. Like, if you're thinking of a question you want to ask John Titor, there's not a bad chance that question was asked and that he answered it. So, yeah, those posts are really the go-to place if you're into John Titor.
Let's focus on the timeline for a minute. When did he show up, and when did he leave?
Yeah, and this is, again, it gets pretty convoluted. I guess the basic narrative is that he first went to 1975. He went to 1975 from 2036. He talks about the capabilities of the machines and how far back they can go. And I believe he says anything past 60 years, you begin to get more and more divergence, and it becomes unstable. So he arrives in 1975. He visits his grandfather, who's one of these IBM engineers. He gets the IBM 5100, and then it's not known well why he went back to 1999. And again, there's that fax to Art Bell in 1998, which contradicts. That's the thing, is like there's so much perfection to this narrative, but then there are things that don't add up. And so at times you wonder, is that intentional? Was that put in there to confuse people? Or, like I was mentioning earlier, have multiple John Titor drawn to multiple world lines? So just to finish, I'm sorry I interjected that. I try to see, that's the thing. You try to make it one clear timeline, and it's hard because there's all these different aspects to it. But so after the 2000-2001 posts, that's when he left essentially. And I have his last post here. His last two posts, and these are very good. On March 24, 2001, he says, "What amazes me is why no one here wonders why Y2K didn't hit them at all." And so what we can draw from this is maybe John Titor did something. He went back to 1975 and he gave information to those computer IBM individuals that could then help prevent our Y2K, and that's why Y2K didn't happen. And then the final post, which was on March 24, 2001, was bring a gas can with you when the car dies on the side of the road, which is kind of ominous and a pretty cool way to end it. So,
do we know then, Mike, where he went?
Presumably he went back to 2036, and one thing he talks about is because you can't get to an exact world line, and the analogy Titor makes is the classic one of folding something over and over again, and you can never get it completely down to nothing, right? It's always going to be a little bit left. So he basically says he can get close back to his original world line, but it won't be the exact same. It'll be like he described, where and he won't know because it's all happening anew for him, but things would be just slightly different. Sorry, go ahead.
We think he went to 2036, but in reality, he could still be hiding here, changing the timeline.
He could be affecting our timeline, and one thing he mentions is that, so if he did go back to his 2036, nothing he'd changed here would be different for him because it would be his timeline again. So the only way to affect change and see it, so for example, there's a classic idea of going back in time and killing Hitler, right? So there's the idea, I go back in time, I kill Hitler, I come back to 2016, and then everything is different because, World War II didn't happen. But it wouldn't, because back in my 2016, Hitler still lived, right? The only way I could see the effects of me killing Hitler would be for me to stay on that timeline and let it transpire.
So, but as we approach our break here at the bottom of the hour, do you think then that he truly went back, or do you think he's playing things out?
I think I believe him. I believe that aspect of the story because he disappeared. But what fascinates me is that YouTube clip posted by Larry Haber where it talks about multiple Titors basically all trying to get back and needing this information online, and that by using this information as a type of roadmap. So this hints that maybe there are these multiple Titors and things are not working out, or it could just be a clever way to sort of stoke the story and keep people interested in it.
It's a question that we will have to learn to answer in the future. We got 30 seconds before we go to break here. Do you think then, and you can start answering this and we'll finish it after the break, do you think then that because he came on the scene with such a storm that maybe he all of a sudden had to go into hiding because the government may want to have a little chat with him?
He does talk about that a lot. He talks about, and he says he claims to be safe from that because people in government just don't think that way. They're not basically hardwired to believe in things that are beyond their scientific capability. So that was always kind of what he presented as sort of a shield against that type of thing.
I assume that, the way the government likes to try and find people, and they don't like people talking around in public, I'm sure there's a little bit bigger part of that, but that might just be the conspiracy theorist in me. Mike, I'm going to put you on hold for the final break of the night. We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. His latest book, The Wraith of Scroman, you can find that on Amazon.com. He is soon going to be writing a new book on John Titor, the time traveler story. You're listening to Spaced Out Radio. I am your host, Dave Scott. When we come back, we're going to learn more about the future life, more about the government, and who this elusive Pamela was. We'll be right back. Want to find out what's coming up on the Spaced Out Radio Network? Go to spacedoutradio.com where you can find our daily list of shows and guests appearing throughout the week. Want to tell us your story? Be sure to sign up for the Spaced Out Forum for free. Maybe you have a psychic question. Drop in and say hi to Catherine in Cat's Corner. SpacedOutRadio.com, your 24-hour source for UFOs, ghosts, conspiracies, and more. Check it out today.
Are you one of many who's had a UFO or ET experience? Listen up. The AZ UFO show is on every Sunday night at 7 on the Spaced Out Radio Network. We talk about UFO sightings across the globe, conspiracy theories, government cover-ups, and more with me, Rich Giordano. I want you to know what's going on in the skies above you, so tune in to the AZ UFO show on Spaced Out Radio Network, on spacedoutradio.com, right before Spaced Out Weekend. Our show is literally out of this world.
Visit purpleplates.com today. For over 40 years, the Purple Energy Plates have been delivering amazing results for their many customers. Inspired by the great genius Nikola Tesla, the harmony, healing, and energetic effects of the plates have proven over and over to be beneficial and often miraculous to thousands of customers. With their money-back guarantee and the many benefits, how can you afford not to get one? Check their site for daily specials and choose from their many energy products. You won't be sorry. Visit them today at purpleplates.com for mind, body, and spirit, and expect a miracle.
You hear footsteps in the empty room above you. A rocking chair begins rocking by itself. Don't be afraid of the things that go bump in the night. Reach for Spirit Storybox, the iPhone app the Huffington Post UK called the only ghost hunting app you will ever need. Spirit Storybox. The spirits are telling their stories. Are you listening?
brand new discovery beats NASA. This is Patrick Webster Small bringing you the Webster Phenomena every Monday night at 8 p.m. And you know what we're going to do? We're going to talk about amazing stuff, have amazing guests. That's all there is, man. You know the rest. Says ET's up in the sky. I'm going to tell you which way and why. And we're going to have a little combo about these ETs in the sky. We're going to chill. This is Patrick Webster Small, and I'll be seeing you every Monday night at 8 p.m. Pacific Time. Write it down on Spaced Out Radio.
Is the 24-hour world starting to wear you down? Let me from Rivulet Reiki and Ratings lend you a hand. Hi, this is Jolene, and if you're in need of Reiki or a realm reading, come to my website, rivuletrr.wix.com/rivuletrr, and let us help you out. At Rivulet, I specialize in healing your body, mind, and soul, no matter where you are. And be sure to check out the Rivulet R&R Facebook page for your best deals. Remember, it's time for you to make some time for you.
Hi there, this is Jim Tyson, host of Spaced Out Weekend. When you've had a busy week and you're just wanting to chill out and relax, how about listening into my show? That's right, Spaced Out Weekend. I focus on the paranormal, the arcane. I even dip into the techie side of things and much, much more. And I would love for you to come in and check it out. Remember, Spaced Out Radio goes 7 days a week. Dave Scott, Monday through Friday, and me, Jim Tyson, rolling through the weekends. I look forward to having you stop by for a listen every Saturday and Sunday night, 1 a.m. Eastern, 10 p.m. Pacific, only on Spaced Out Radio.
Missed most of tonight's show? Don't worry, you didn't miss a thing. You can head to our website where you can download the podcast at spacedoutradio.com. Now, back to tonight's show. Here's Dave Scott.
Welcome back to Space Out Radio tonight, an interesting show that we are doing on time travel. It's been great. John Titor's story, it's so elusive. I love this story, and we'll continue it with our guest, Mike Sauve, momentarily. I do want to remind you that we broadcast 7 days a week, Monday through Saturday, 10 p.m. Pacific, and on Sundays, 9 p.m. Pacific, Space Out Weekend, Saturdays and Sundays with James Tyson. And myself, I'm in the hot seat in the cabin between Monday through Friday. If you want to follow us on social media, you can do so on Twitter at Spaced Out Radio. Give our Facebook page a like, Spaced Out Radio Show. You can also join our Podcast Central group and our Spaced Out Radio group. On Instagram, I can be found at Dave Scott, SOR, and our website is spacedoutradio.com. Take the time to join our free forum as well. Tomorrow night on the show, we'll be talking dreams with dream expert Kelly Sullivan Walden. It'll be a fun show. What is in your dreams? I never remember mine. I have no idea. I do want to give a quick shout out to a packed house in the Spaced Out Radio chat room tonight. Thank you so much for joining us and your great questions. Keep them up, as well as our listenership at paranormalforum.net. Thank you so much for tuning us in tonight as well. For the final time tonight, we bring in Mike Sauve, his website, mikesauve.com. Sauve spelled SAUVE.com. And he is an author as well as a journalist, and we're discussing time travel with John Titor. And right before the break, we were talking about John's timeline. We were talking about what has come true, what hasn't come true. Is there anything that still amazes you now, 15 years later since the last post left, that there is still news trickling out? What is new in regards to this?
The latest news, I guess, would probably be when Larry Haber was on the Jimmy Church show, and he said there would be new news coming in the next few months, but that news never manifested. So that was kind of like a little tease. But what it does suggest is, again, assuming this is all real, that Kay Titor had told Larry, "Oh, there's something new, and it's coming down the pipe." And so the people involved with this aren't letting it go by the wayside. That's for sure.
Very interesting indeed. Now, earlier in the show, you mentioned a lady's name named Pamela, that she was communicating with him on a very human level, rather than talking about time travel, rather than talking about the physics that go behind it. She was more asking the emotional side of it. Can you describe Pamela's role in all of this?
She was. She did those things. She was one of the more prominent figures that were questioning John Titor time and again. She also was one of the few, if maybe not the only, who communicated with him personally. They would have personal instant messenger chat. And what's interesting about Pamela is there's a so-called secret song that John gave to Pamela, and it's meant to be a confirmation. So if someone comes forward and says, I'm John Titor, or I wrote John Titor, then he can run this secret song, or anyone can run this secret song by Pamela, and she can verify whether it is the person who was calling himself John Titor. And so far, this hasn't happened.
Has anybody talked to this Pamela lady about this, or has she gone silent in regards to it as well?
She's gone a little bit silent. There's an individual called the Hoax Hunter, and he posts these YouTube videos, and he's very into debunking the John Titor story. And he had some exchanges with Pamela, and I guess she had a negative experience with that, or I believe she did, and she sort of went underground after that. The Hoax Hunter is sort of famous or notorious for this very long 40-minute video that suggests Maury or John Rick Haber is behind it, and it used text comparison. But I consider it, and others consider it, a little bit of a dubious comparison. It would be like taking a bunch of my text and just comparing it to any text and finding similar words, essentially.
So, do we know if she is still active or in communication with John Titor? Has she ever released any information since then? Because, for 15, 16 years, to be silent on something like this, that's a tough secret to keep.
Yeah, up until she's... the assumption is that she is, like all of us, essentially waiting on John Titor to return. She's not... I can't recall, the last date she posted. She was still active on... I think it's Paranormalis and a few of these more prominent message boards where people discuss John Titor, and she was active until quite recently, and then now she's just kind of gone. But I believe the assumption isn't so much that she's been whisked away by John Titor as I think this story does, like any good paranormal story or mystery, it does attract some cranks, right? So I think she's just maybe been harassed by one too many loons and just kind of wants to be under the radar for the time being.
Did John say whether or not he would ever return?
John, he didn't say if he would return. I believe that the general idea was always that he was going to return. He was here for a set period of time, and his mission, again, he said he was there in 99 for personal reasons and for archiving, and that he was going to go back to 2036, and then that would be it. I don't believe there was any talk of return. There would be no purpose, essentially, for him to return. The purpose, keep in mind, he's a soldier working for the military. He has orders, right? So his orders were to go back and get this IBM 5100, and that's actually one of the things that the posters questioned him on. They said, well, if you're a soldier working for the military, how are they just letting you take they used to say it was a $5 billion machine. I don't know if that was ever verified by John, but they would say, why would they let you take this $5 billion machine just on your little vacation to 1999? But it was never said that he was going to come back.
We are talking with author and journalist Mike Sauve tonight on Spaced Out Radio. His website, MikeSauve.com. You can find his book, The Wraith of Scroman, on Amazon right now, and soon a book on John Titor as well, as Mike is a very great researcher in regards to this topic tonight. Thank you so much. Now, there was a role that a gentleman named Marlon Pullman played in this. Explain who he is.
Sure. Marlon Pullman, you want to talk about news in the John Titor community. Well, he shook things up when it was announced that he had filed a patent that was based entirely on the schematics that John Titor had posted. In fact, I've looked at the patent. It's a 30-page patent, and the images are the exact John Titor images. They're lifted directly from it. Now, this might give a person pause and say, okay, well, this person isn't credible. But Marlon Pullman was, and maybe it's important to stress the word was, very credible. He was Director of Government's Risk and Compliance Product Strategy for a big software company. He wrote textbooks on Oracle management. So he has a PhD. So this guy was an academic and a thinker. And so I've looked at this patent, and it So when you file a patent, it doesn't mean you're going to receive the patent. You can just file the patent, and it can just linger or it can be rejected. And what the problem with the patent that even me as a layman can recognize is that it relies on things that don't yet exist. Like John Titor's time machine relies on these Tipler sinusoids and Kerr black holes. So it's essentially a black hole or a singularity brought down to the size where it can fit within this temporal displacement unit, and we obviously don't have that. So there's no way this patent was going to ever, come to fruition. But the Marlon Pullman saga ends rather sadly, where he was actually charged with drugging and raping several women. So, and he was also had a pretty serious drug problem. So Marlon Pullman is, pleaded guilty to attempted second-degree assault, unlawful possession of drugs, and so after doing this, things didn't go so well for Marlon Pullman.
That almost ruins his own credibility in regards to what he was doing.
Well, it doesn't help, that's for sure. And but if you look at the patent, it's not the work of a crazed drug addict. It's the work of someone who at least is well versed in what he's talking about. And so it's just interesting that he would do it. I guess maybe he felt it was feasible enough that if he had this patent, that by the time we could, capture a black hole in a time machine size unit, then maybe they'd have to go through him. I'm not really sure what his motivations were.
What about Joseph Matheny?
Well, Joseph Matheny is fascinating because he, on a podcast called Project Archivist, claimed to be behind the John Titor story. And there's lots of bona fides for Joseph Matheny, which would make him a good candidate. He was behind one of an alternate reality game called Ong's Hat. And Ong's Hat was essentially like a made-up narrative about that presented itself as facts, and so it's in line with the John Titor story. And what's so on this podcast, at first when I heard it, I didn't want to give it much credence because he's never really pressed to give any hard evidence, and he's very dismissive of people who are into the story. He's essentially saying, I can't believe people believe this, and I threw the 5100 in there because everyone would just realize it's stupid, and John Titor sounds like John Connor, so everybody should have just got it. And he also talks about so he says that he did the story with a few friends who all work in the movie industry, and that they no longer wanted to be a part of it, but that he was very angry when Larry Haber came forward and released Conviction of a Time Traveler, because part of the deal he had with his friends, not including Larry Haber, was no one would make money. So he claims he called Larry Haber and threatened him and said, you have to take this book off Amazon. And the book is gone off Amazon. So there must be something to that. But the thing that makes Joseph Matheny so interesting to this case is there is a reference to Ong's Hat in the posts. So that to me is like a huge red flag that if someone is involved, I think it has to be Joseph Matheny. But what doesn't make sense to me is if he wants credit for this, and he really did do it, there would be so many ways he could just drop hard evidence, and he does none of that. So it almost seems it's another one of these weird things. It seems like it's misdirection, or I just can't really wrap my head around what he was doing on that podcast, why there's that reference to Ong's Hat in the original post. And that's something that never comes up, by the way. It seems like that's sort of slipped through the cracks. And one last Joseph Matheny thing that I find really compelling is, I've mentioned him a few times, is Temporal Recon, who wrote Conviction of a Time Traveler. He was on a podcast once, and somebody asked him if he was familiar with Joseph Matheny, and he said no. And I later saw that he, on his Facebook, he had RSVP to an event of Joseph Matheny's, and that in itself doesn't really mean anything. You could RSVP to an event without being consciously aware of who someone is, or you could forget who they are. But the subtitle of Ong's Hat is called Journey Through the Incunabula. I think I'm pronouncing that right. And then Temporal Recon, who should have no connection to Joseph Matheny or claims not to, wrote a blog post about John Titor with the word incunabula in the title. And Incunabula, I forget exactly what it means, but it's something like a parchment or it's like an old-time document of some sort, and the post has nothing to do with that. So he's clearly making this reference to Joseph Matheny. And I actually asked him about it on Facebook, and he just said, oh, this strikes me as big of a coincidence as it's striking you. So here you have this guy who wrote this book that very clearly illustrates all the reasons why you should believe in John Titor, who seems to have this connection to this guy who's kind of dismissively saying, oh, how could anyone have fallen for this? And it's another layer to this mystery.
Do you think that people are trying to close the loopholes to try and discredit the whole John Titor story, or do you think they're trying to protect everyone that could be involved?
Yeah, that's a good question, and it sort of seems like a little bit of both. I definitely feel so. For example, I gave that. I earlier mentioned how Larry Haber didn't want much criticism or speculation directed at his brother. So there's a case where maybe he's trying to shield him, but then maybe his brother really does have nothing to do with it, and you can imagine how upsetting that would be if your reputation is suddenly linked with this thing you have nothing to do with. So there's an example. But then on the other hand, there's people like, I keep mentioning Oliver Williams, Temporal Recon, who I just mentioned in the same vein. They both seem, and now again, these people very clearly could just be like me, just be very into the story and just know the details down. But my instinct tells me I get a strong sense that they're selling the story sometimes. So maybe, so it all comes back to this mystery. There's a consortium. Who's in it? And if it exists, it's multiple people, and then how are these people related to each other? Here's another interesting little coincidence of sorts. Not only do they both live in Florida, but after Larry Haber was on that Jimmy Church show, who calls in but Oliver Williams? And Jimmy Church isn't expecting Oliver Williams to call in, and they kind of. He discusses, he seems to know a lot about what Larry's been through, but then, and he criticizes Larry even. He says incredulously, why did he agree to go on your show? Why do you do that? It makes no sense. Like if Haber is trying to, why keep fanning the flames, Williams is saying. Yet it would, I don't know, strange coincidence. He was on right after him maybe, but there's all these tiny links, it seems. It's very interesting.
It almost seems like a petty party, the way you're describing it, on who's going to get credit for the whole John Titor phenomena.
Except no one's taking the credit. The only person who's taken the credit is Joseph Matheny, who, to me, it seems like there is a lot of evidence Joseph Matheny may well be behind it, but when he took the credit, he didn't really seem to be doing a very convincing job. The hosts of that show are a little bit on the they seem to be big admirers of Joseph Matheny, and they're just everything he says, they're just laughing very hard, kind of laughing at all the people who would believe it, like, oh, how could they even believe that? It's so simplistic. So if you ask me, if I'm Joseph Matheny, who's this credible figure in the alternate reality gaming and also in the software world, and he wants the credit for it, and he did it, he could get the credit for it, but he didn't really seem to do it. And if Oliver, it's almost like all these people want the story to stay alive, but they don't. Maybe one theory is that maybe the people who are behind it can't come forward for some reason, and I don't know what that reason might be. It could be that they've gone on to careers where it would hurt their careers, or who knows, right? That's what it all comes back to. Is like if it's fake. Why? Why is there no John Titor movie? Why is there no money being made? What's the purpose, essentially? And we don't know, right? So that's why I think the mystery of who could be behind it is right there on par with the mystery of, is John Titor a real time traveler?
We are talking with Mike Sauve tonight on Space Out Radio, his website, MikeSauve.com. He's an author as well as a journalist. Mike, there's a lot of pictures that John Titor provided in what the time travel machine looked like. Yep. When you look at that, and many people much smarter than us with scientific backgrounds have looked at it, do we know if it's ever been replicated?
Well, people certainly couldn't say what the time machine was. There was some speculation on what it might be. I think one concept was that it might have been like a radiation detector. But then So there is speculation, but there's no real hard line of, oh, that's this, right? Although, to get back to Matheny for a second, when he's on that Project Archivist podcast, he says, oh, we just threw that together, and the hosts are kind of laughing, and even though like a lot of people are still talking about it, it's just one more thing that is like, oh yeah, ha ha ha, how could anybody fall for that, right? So there's a lot to. I mean, like I talked about earlier, like the detail and the pull-out drawing. I think one of the things that gives the story a lot of validity is the quality of those pictures and the quality of those drawings. Also, the John Titor manual. He posted all the images of his manual.
So we really don't know then whether or not the government took that information and built a time machine, or we don't know if anybody in their garage who's a backdoor scientist has tried to create a time travel machine that has effectively or possibly worked.
Well, like with the Marlon Pullman saga, we know we don't have black holes that we can just put into a machine yet. We do know things are happening at CERN where maybe that will be feasible in 15 or 20 years. So that's probably the big stumbling block there. Maybe, who knows? Like if we want to really get into the conspiratorial thinking, you could say this is essentially what's happening at CERN, right? They're working towards this, but yeah, we don't know. What I can say confidently is no one could build this in their garage today because we don't have that technology.
When we look at the technology, do we know if he actually provided everything to do with creating time travel? Or do we know if he actually left parts out so that way we could not duplicate what he was doing?
Yeah, I mean, I guess, again, it gets back to what I said, is that he probably knew that we hadn't been able to, rein in singularities yet. But there is a lot of talk about that, like, it's good you don't believe me because then it would just be all about, how do we do this? And he does talk about essentially like not allowing that information out there.
Did he discuss at all about how long it took to get from 2036 back to 1975? And also, did he talk to anybody with how it truly worked? Like, was it like the DeLorean in Back to the Future where he just programmed in the numbers and off he went?
I think he said it was an hour per year, if I recall correctly. I could be a little off there. And he does describe the situation quite a bit. He said it's like being in a sensory deprivation tank. Everything essentially kind of goes away, and you're just sitting there in like darkness. He also talks about what other people would experience. He said so for his military handlers in 2036, to them it would just look like the machine went blurry for a moment, wavy around the machine, and then he would be back within like a millisecond, like as fast as human comprehension. So no matter how long he's gone for, he's going to be right back, essentially.
But did he explain at all to anyone here that we know of on how it truly worked, much like Doc and Marty McFly?
Unlike Doc and Marty McFly, it would be more like, it's not even like popular science, like listening to someone like Michio Kaku or Brian Greene. It would be like going to MIT and sitting in on like a physics lab that's like mid-semester. It's not introductory at all. And it's because at times he was talking to people who were, quite competent with physics. So there are plenty of descriptions. I'm not going to read any of them, but anyone who's interested, just get into the post and you'll find them like all over the posts. Lengthy descriptions of how it works.
So does anybody know where this story truly ends? Go ahead,
Dave. I have a quick one here. Actually, it just says, my time machine is a stationary mass temporal displacement unit manufactured by General Electric. The unit is powered by two top-spin dual positive singularities that produce a standard offset Tipler sinusoid. And that's one of the more straightforward, simple ones. There's plenty that are about 10 times that length that are addressing very specific questions that people ask. So that's just sort of a taste of how he was talking about the time machine.
Well, let's take a look at it then this way. because this is the never-ending story, even though it ended 15 years ago. I mean, hell, in the Guns N' Roses reunion happened a lot quicker than this story happening, and I'm a diehard GNR fan, so I always try and make a reference to Guns N' Roses anytime I can. But in the meantime, you mentioned that there is little tidbits that keep seeping out. They may take a while, but that information keeps seeping out. Where is this information coming from then, besides Larry Haber? Are there other people involved? Is it maybe the Titor family in Florida that is releasing this tidbit?
Yeah, it could be. And another thing that happened is like what you mentioned with the Stephen Hawking thing, is there are aspects to the posts that become relevant as a result of things that are occurring, right? And so it doesn't take really anyone to propagate that, because it's happening in the real world. And so if I wanted to put a name on that, I would probably put a name on Oliver Williams, who is this guy who will go on coast to coast, and he'll point these things out, and he'll say, look, here, hey, look, this happened, this happened, this happened. So, yeah, that's it essentially. And to answer your question about the family, I would say if the Larry Haber story is to be believed, they're, if anything, being quite guarded. I mean, there was that talk that something new would come out, and then it didn't, but they're certainly not fanning the flames. And I've also, I believe Larry Haber said they had moved, because I believe the talk is that they moved to Nebraska, which would actually fit in line with the John Titor story, because Omaha went on to become the state capital, or the U.S. capital, because of it was one of the few safe places remaining. So the idea that they had moved there would fit, because he would say, well, get here because it's going to be safe after all this stuff happens.
So as someone now who wants to write a book on this, how do you take it to the next level?
The paradigm I'm writing the book through is that I'm going to tell the John Titor story rather briefly, because I'm not sort of gearing the book towards just the average civilian. I'm gearing it to someone who's probably already familiar with the John Titor story. And then what I'm mostly going to focus on are the links between these individuals that are associated with it. And, I thought of the title, Who is John Titor? But I think somebody already wrote a meaning, like who was behind John Titor, essentially. But I think someone wrote a PDF or something called that, so I'll have to think of something else. But that's going to be my approach, essentially. But at no point do I mean to just dismiss it like as though it's not the case. I definitely want to give that some weight, that it's certainly one of the possibilities, that John Titor was a real time traveler.
How do you go about trying to track down witnesses or people to talk to? Because as a journalist, that kind of is the stickler that we try and go through, is we want to have those voices rather than making it, say, 300 pages of opinion.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I'm not really at that stage yet where I'm doing interviews. I've been more getting my ducks in a row in terms of getting my head around all this information. But what I'm going to be doing is just contacting the parties involved, and it'll be interesting to see who's up for talking and who isn't. Right? That might tell me something right there.
Indeed it is. Indeed it is. And you know what, my friend? We got about 1 minute left on this show. I would love it if you could tell our audience about what's on your website, where they can find your book, The Wraith of Scroman, and what it's about.
Sure. My website is just basically a repository for where my work will appear. You'll see some of my journalism articles. You'll see some film reviews I've written. You'll see a lot of short stories I wrote. And then you will see links to a link. It'll be up there to The Wraith of Scroman. And it's a book about basically a coming-of-age story. Also, like sort of a teen comedy, I guess, in a way, but in a literary vein. And, I wrote that in 2012. It was my first novel, and I think I'm quite proud of it. I think it holds up. And it's just came out last week, so it's going to be interesting to see how people respond to it. There are, it is, as the title indicates, The Wraith of Scroman, so there is a ghost in it for lovers of the paranormal, but I wouldn't say it's like a dyed-in-the-wool paranormal book. My next book, which is coming out from the same publisher, Montag Press, it's called The Apocalypse of Lloyd, and it incorporates a lot. It's basically about the apocalypse, but it's like a breakdown in general logic and order. So it incorporates a lot of the subjects you would deal with this on this show, and subjects you'd hear on Coast to Coast, like economic collapse and zombies and witches and just all these things. Kind of a big hodgepodge of all of kind of my favorite subjects. So with that one, I get into that. And as mentioned earlier, yet unpublished, I'm querying agents with it now. I Ain't Got No Home in This World Anymore is a time travel novel and does have a minor John Titor subplot.
Exactly. Mike, thank you so much for being on Space Out Radio tonight, filling us in on John Titor's story. It's been a fast 2 hours, my friend. I really appreciate your time.
No problem.
Take care, my friend.
Bye-bye.
Do you have a topic or guest you'd like to hear on Spaced Out Radio? Email us, dave@spacedoutradio.com. Send us a quick message on Twitter @SpacedOutRadio or a message on our Facebook page, Spaced Out Radio. Once again, here's Dave Scott.
And once again, I want to thank Mike Sauve for being on Space Out Radio tonight. MikeSauve.com is his website. And you know what? That was a fun show. I was hoping it would be like that. It's exactly what we asked for, learning about John Titor. It's a story that will never end, even though it ended in 2001. How weird is that to say? Tomorrow night on the show, Kelly Sullivan-Walden will join us. We're going to talk dreams with the dream expert herself. Hey, on social media, follow us on Twitter @SpacedOutRadio, Facebook, Spaced Out Radio Show. Give our page a like. I'm on Instagram, Dave Scott SOR, as well as SpacedOutRadio.com is our website. Quick shout-out. Thank you to everyone in the Space Out Radio chat room and at ParanormalForum.net. Appreciate your support and love. We'll do it all again in exactly 22 hours. We're talking dreams tomorrow night. Hey, guess what? We all get to go to bed. It's late. Turn the lights out. Time to turn this off. We're done. See you.